All right, this is part two, I suppose, of the review guide. I ran out of free recording time. So I was talking about Great Zimbabwe, and I kind of cut the Swahili coast a little bit short. You should just know the type of things that they're able to import and export. Okay, so Great Zimbabwe, you should know about the walled cities. You should know it's really its location that makes it wealthy. And when merchants find ways around its location, it's going to decline. We don't know exactly what happens, but um, one thing we know from the video is that Great Zimbabwe is actually taxing at a crazy high tax rate of 50%. So if you're an ivory merchant traveling from the interior of Africa to sell your ivory to one of the city states so it can go, possibly to Asia where they were used for things like sword handles, um, you would have to give half of all of the ivory you collected to the rulers in Great Zimbabwe to be able to get through to East Africa. For Swahili culture, you should know about it. It's in East Africa. It's very distinct. I talked about it with some detail up above. For art in West Africa, so this is specifically West Africa here. We're talking about griots, who are the storytellers and the keepers of oral tradition. You should know that that's passed down through each family. It's through their lineage. And then you should also know one other form of art and how it's used. So most people did the Yoruba beads or the Sunday masquerades. So the art in Africa is functional, right? So we would call that functional art, and that a lot of the art is meant to be utilized and meant to be part of a ceremony. So wearing the beaded crown to show your status, and having in part of that ties to traditional ancestors or gods. And you see that the Sunday masquerade is a rite of passage. So when girls become women, they go and it's part of how they embed them in society. But the masks are meant to be used, right? They're hidden and then they're meant to be used. You should be able to tell me how whatever form of art you chose is tied to their culture. And if it is tied to religion, you should be able to know that as well. So just give a brief example or two of how the art makes that connection for West Africa. For the agricultural revolution, I apologize. I know some of you did the reading, so maybe you can skip this. A quick overview is that basically you had knowledge of agriculture in antiquity and ancient times. And then there's the sense, at least in the Middle East and the West, that that's lost when the Roman Empire falls. Um, and that it's the point is that it gets revived during the Islamic age, particularly the Golden Age. If you think about the things they're doing in the Golden Age, they're trying to solve, scholars at first are trying to solve the problems of the empire. So, how to manage large cities, how to rule over a big, diverse empire. But it's also going to be problems like how to feed the empire, which leads to this agricultural revolution. And it's going to be spread through scholars, through paper, through books, but also through the Islamic view that knowledge is meant to be shared, and knowledge was meant to improve their society. And so we see things like cities managing and rulers managing irrigation so that the irrigation in the water is benefiting all of the people who live there. And we see, libraries of knowledge of agriculture, of how and when to plant, and information about fertilization, and just really an explosion of that kind of knowledge. Another interesting thing, a difference between Islam and Europe, is the way they viewed land ownership. So it's sort of incentivized. You get fair pay if you are a laborer on the land versus serfs who kind of are doing like forced to work and don't get much back. Sorry, there's also opportunity to own the land. And so it's a different type of land ownership where it's not so stuck in the elites. In fact, there are plenty of wealthy Islamic elites who don't own much property, maybe own a nice home in a city. So it's not as wealth and status is not as tied to land as it would be in Europe at the same time. And kind of the end result is that you have this flourishing of agriculture spread across the empire. And you also have plants that are maybe native to the Middle East or the Levant, is what it talks about, which is like near Jerusalem, the Holy Land. and plants that were being grown in Spain. And because merchants are constantly traveling and scholars are traveling and they're writing and they're sharing their information, you're going to see, plants native to like places like India, like sugar and cotton, being transported and being grown in other places in the empire, and kind of that sort of spread. It's probably the biggest kind of sharing of agricultural knowledge that's going to happen before they hit to the new world, and then we're going to have a second wave of a similar thing happening. For universities at Timbuktu, you should know that they're attracting scholars from across the Muslim world, that it was known, kind of defeats that myth that nothing was happening, and that we know many of the scholars that were there were native African scholars, and they were writing in Arabic because that was the language that scholars used in the Islamic world. And so it kind of defeats that myth that it must have been an outsider, it couldn't have been Africans. We now know that it was. Um, and I just, you need to know about camels. I don't need to stress that. For historiography, you should know two myths. I would focus on maybe the myth that there was no civilization worth knowing. That's a lot of West Africa, and that's due to the oral traditions and the lack of written records, which we now know there are actually more written records than historians in, say, the 1800s realized. There's been a lot of new African scholarship in the last, say, 40 to 50 years, where a lot of written records have been recovered, and a lot of new types of historical, like ways historians can learn about the past have been used, based, combining science and genetics, and that kind of analysis. The other myth was the myth about East Africa, that in order to have the great cities on the East Coast, it must have been colonized. And from the second reading that that's not the case. And that second reading outlines a couple of reasons why we know definitively it's not the case that East Africa was colonized, that they were actually native East Africans. And then finally, the last question you'll have to do is to compare and contrast East and West Africa, which you can pull information from this chart. I'm going to also attach a document to help you kind of organize your information that we will go over on Monday.